Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. Hello, students. I apologize that I won't be able to meet with you on Thursday, so here's a recorded video. Skeleton Man over here would like to say hi to you. So during this video, we're going to talk about Intro to Cellular Respiration. Cellular respiration is what we're going to be talking about throughout our entire cycle, and this is just a little bit of introduction after our lab that we did on Tuesday. So let's get into it. Your job is to pay attention to this video as much as you can, and then rewatch whichever part that you couldn't pay attention to, and then pause at each slide to take some notes. I'm going to collect notes from you guys so that I know you watched it. I also know you watched it because I'm posting this on Edpuzzle. Anyway, let's get right into it. So, cellular respiration. Oh, this image right here is here for a reason. What you see over here, we see this really happy child. We see this pigeon trying to get some bread. I don't know if this child is trying to eat the same bread, but either way, there's a lot going on, right? We got some animals, we got some food. Animals, humans who are animals, we all do cell respiration because we have cells in our body, and cells do cell respiration. And you can't just do cell respiration based off of nothing, right? You all know that if you stop eating, first off, that's a very uncomfortable, hungry feeling. But then at the same time, if you go without food for too long, you're not going to survive, right? So there's a reason why we eat food. We eat food so that we can feed ourselves, basically, right? It's almost like you have a little goldfish living inside your body and you got to feed it, but except it's just yourselves, and you eat food because you want to, and that's great. So cellular respiration, when we talk about cellular respiration, generally we're talking about the aerobic respiration. So if you think back to Tuesday, we talked about aerobic respiration that uses oxygen versus anaerobic respiration that does not use oxygen. So right now we're gonna, well, especially this entire cycle, we're gonna focus mostly on aerobic respiration, but we'll just touch on anaerobic respiration just a little bit at the end of the class today. So in this picture, what you see right here is a burning marshmallow. It's not just a toasted marshmallow. It's on fire. Some of you might like your marshmallows burnt, and that's totally fine. But the reason why this picture is here is to tell you that burning something, anything, food, tree, whatever, is one way that energy can be released, right? The reason why you can burn something and you can see the light, you can see the heat. Light and heat are energy, right? It makes you warmer. That's energy, right? The reason why this can happen is because inside whatever that you're burning, there are chemical bonds that are breaking, right? We're breaking those bonds and we're releasing energy from the chemicals inside whatever thing that you're burning, right? So this is one way that energy can be released, but this is a very violent way of releasing energy, right? This is it's too efficient. You got all these energy and then it's gone, right? So in our body, this is not what we want. We don't want to just eat a marshmallow and it's gone in 1 minute, right? We want whatever food that we eat to stay in our body for a little while, and we want to release that energy slowly. And not only that, we also want to save some for the darker days, right? It can't, I mean, usually you're not eating in the middle of the night all throughout the hours that you sleep. It will be a little weird if you sleep for 8 hours and you're chewing on things. No judgment here. But the idea here is that in our body, in animals, plants, even yeast, bacteria, you have to find a good way of using that energy in your body, kind of have a slow release of energy. So cellular respiration is an example, very important example of a slow release of energy. Okay, that's enough of me talking. Let's look at some notes. So what is cellular respiration? Go ahead and write down this sentence, and then I would encourage you to either highlight or underline the words that I marked as red. I forgot to mark the other pages, but this one I did. So what is it? It's a process that allows us to release energy from food in the presence of oxygen. So you can pause right now and write this down, or you can pause at the end of the slide and write everything down, okay? So things we already talked about, right? We eat food. There's energy inside the food, but that energy is not very accessible for our cells. Not directly, right? We talk about how glucose is, glucose sugar is very stable. It's nice and tasty, but that form of energy is not usable for our cells in our body. They're too stable, too big. And if you release energy, there's too much energy. It's not a slow release of energy. So what do? We transform the forms of energy in food into ATP, which is a more accessible form of energy for our body. Okay. So who does it? Every single type of living organism, everything. If you think of a living organism, it does cell respiration. Okay. So, for example, I really like river otters. They're one of my favorite animals, and they do cell respiration. That's fantastic. They're alive. I like it when animals are alive. Think of anything, really. Bacteria. Bacteria, any kind of unicellular organism, yeast, for example, fungi. Sometimes fungi are unicellular, sometimes they're multicellular, but they all do cell respiration. That's what we care about. Okay, so like I said, cell respiration allows a controlled release of energy, right? You got this much energy. I need this much energy. We release it slowly. This is how much I need. That's how much I release, okay? So that not all energy is lost to light and heat, right? So burning a marshmallow, for example, is not a slow release of energy. As you can see, a marshmallow can be finished burning pretty quickly, right? And a lot of energy is lost to light. As you can see, the light and heat, you know how heat works, right? So in our body, we don't release light, but we do release heat. And that's a good thing, that a lot of chemical reactions in our body release heat. On one hand, it seems like a waste of time, right? A waste of energy, because it's just a heat, right? It's gone. It's here and it's gone. But at the same time, it's really good for us because as warm-blooded animals, we actually need that heat. So this inefficient kind of chemical reactions are actually really good for us. We need that heat, okay? So as a summary, well, more of an overview of what we talk about, we have glucose. We just talk about glucose a lot because oftentimes food gets broken down into glucose and then we use it for cell respiration. Glucose is a monomer, it's a monosaccharide, it's a monomer for carbohydrate. Okay, so what happens during cell respiration? We turn glucose into ATP, right? We harvest the energy from glucose, the bonds inside the glucose, break them apart. We'll talk about how exactly that happens. And then we make a whole bunch of ATP, and the ATP is what allows cellular activities to happen. You can't go from glucose directly to cellular activity. All right. Moving on to the second page, we have this picture right here. We have photosynthesis, right? We spent a whole cycle, the last cycle, talking about photosynthesis. And you can see the reactants and the products of photosynthesis. So now you really need to train your brain to look at arrows, right? So if an arrow is pointing at something, that means it's a reactant or something that this reaction needs. So light is needed for photosynthesis. It's not exactly a reactant because it's not a chemical. And so we have the reactants, right? So these are the reactants for photosynthesis, and these are the products. So I want you to pause and think about and write down on your notes, what are some things that you see here, right? On this image, what do you see? What is the relationship? What are some differences? Go ahead and pause. All right, you're back? Fantastic. Okay, so I would ask you to answer it, except to me, except I can't teleport to you right now and hear your answers. So hopefully you wrote down some things. These are my answers, okay? So let's take a look at the relationships first. We see these are the reactants for photosynthesis, right? But we also see that pointing out from this rabbit to eating this poor little plant, right? So these are also the products of cell respiration. So what you want to remember is really for cell respiration, photosynthesis, you just need to remember one of the equations. And you take the reactions of the products and you flip them. So as you can see, these water and carbon dioxide are the reactants for photosynthesis, but they're also the products of cell respiration. And then the products of photosynthesis, which are glucose and oxygen, those are also the reactants for cell respiration. This is a perfect system, right? We get more of the story. The reactant of photosynthesis is the product of cell respiration, where you can say the product of cell respiration is the reactant of photosynthesis. And then the product of photosynthesis is the reactant of cell respiration, okay? That's the relationship. Make sure you have this down on your notes if you haven't written this down already. And then we have, let's talk about a little bit of difference, right? So for photosynthesis, the required input of energy is light. But for cell respiration, the input of energy is glucose. Glucose itself already has energy, right? Sugar, food, got energy. Great. That's why we want to eat them. Go eat some food later. Cell respiration, as you can also see, produces ATP and heat energy. Well, we're trying to produce ATP, and that's great. But there's also heat loss during the process, kind of as a byproduct of the reaction, but it's actually a really important product for us as warm-blooded animals, or really any animal, okay? Yeah, that's all on this page. On to the next. Let's take a look at the equation. So now you can clearly see, right, the reactants. Well, it was pretty clear on this page too, but over here we have CO2 and water as our reactants for photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen as products. And then now glucose and oxygen are the reactants for cell respiration, and we have CO2 and H2O as our products of cell respiration. So now your job is to write down this equation of cell respiration. Go ahead and pause and write down this equation, okay? You can write it down. You need the chemical formula. You need to know how to do this, but you can write both if you want to do that, okay? Pause. You're back again. Oh my goodness, so exciting. All right. Now, we've talked about ATP, right? Cell respiration produces ATP. Once again, let's take a look at ATP as a review. ATP is our charge battery. ATP holds a good amount of energy. The reason for that, as you might remember, is these phosphate groups, these 3 phosphate groups of ATP has a lot of negative charges on them, and they're being packed together. And the negative charges repel each other, and they don't want to be so near each other, right? So we're putting all these tension in between, all these negative charges repelling, but they can't repel because they're bonded together. So ATP holds energy that way, okay? Going from ATP to ADP is very, very convenient, right? There are 3 phosphate groups, all got a bunch of negative charges, but then the last phosphate group just get pushed off the bus, right? There's not enough space for you. Get out of here. So this 3rd phosphate group, the last phosphate group, falls off very easily. And during that process, we're releasing some of that tension, right? The negative charges are not pushing each other as hard because there aren't as many negative charges being packed together. So over here, as you can see, going from ATP to ADP, we release energy. Don't worry about water. You'll learn about what's going on with water in AP Bio if you want to come in a few years. So releasing energy, right? So that's great, right? Our body does that all the time. We got ATP, we release some energy, and then that energy that's being released during this process gets used for other activities such as active transport. And then on the other side, we have ADP to ATP, right? You can't just keep using ATP, you're going to be out of it. But so at some point, you got to form some ATP, right? So how do you get that energy? Going from ATP to ATP requires an input of energy to pack the ATP and the phosphate group together, right? Okay, right? So how do we do that? Where do you get that energy? During photosynthesis, you learn how ATP synthase works. But now you think about it, in our body, we're not doing photosynthesis. We can't make ATP that way. What do we do? Where do you get that energy from? Think about it. Oh, remember that food that we talked about? Oh, it doesn't actually show you the answer. But it requires an input of energy. It comes from food, right? You eat some food. The food sits in your stomach. It gets broken down. But when the food gets broken down, there's releasing of energy. The energy goes right into this process. We make ATP using that energy harvested from food. That's why we eat food. I don't know why I keep saying that. We all know. You know at this point why we eat food, right? Right, I hope. Okay. All right, moving on. Let's do a little drawing. Mitochondria. So mitochondria, you've heard all your life, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. But really, what does that even mean, right? Is mitochondria just powerhousing using nothing, right? Well, where in mitochondria do all these processes happen? These are all questions that we're going to answer in the next few days. So what you need to do right now is to pause and draw this mitochondria, okay? So this is how you draw it. You draw an outer membrane and you draw an inner membrane. The inner membrane has a bunch of folds. You can draw however many folds you want. I drew this using my mouse and it's not very good. Bear with me. So what I want you to label is cristae, well, after you're done drawing, the matrix, the outer membrane, the inner membrane, as well as the intermembrane space, okay? So take a look at this. You can label it if you already know what they are, or I'll tell you where they are. Okay, so let's start with the outer membrane, right? So we've done this with chloroplast. We know the outer membrane is just on the outside. That makes perfect sense, right? So this one right here is our outer membrane. Go ahead and draw a little arrow or something and label it as outer membrane. And then we have the inner membrane, which is the inside. This entire inside membrane is the inner membrane. And then we have the intermembrane space, right? Is inter is in between. Intermembrane space is the space in between the two membranes. So that's the space all in between the two membranes, okay? So you can draw an arrow to this space. That's called the intermembrane space. Now, we have matrix. Let's talk about the matrix. The matrix is inside the inner membrane, which is this space right here. Okay, don't get these words confused with the words that we talk about in chloroplast. I'm not going to say them so you don't get confused, but it's the same idea. It's this liquid enzyme-filled space right here. That's the matrix, okay? Lastly, we have something called the cristae. Cristae are the folds on the inner membrane, okay? So if you draw a box right here, or if you draw a box on any of the inner folds, any of the folds, if you look at this picture, that fold, the fold, is that enough fold? Okay, all those folds are called cristae, okay? I think a good way that you can remember this is if you look at the name, right? There are a lot of folds in this word. There's A and E, and there's a lot of folds. I don't know. All these are pretty easy. The matrix and the cristae. Make sure you don't get the two confused. All right, so now you have the mitochondrial structure. This is very important. You have to know the structure of the mitochondria because there are different steps of the mitochondria that take place at different parts of the mitochondria, okay? So now, we are going to do a little stand-up. If you're sitting at a workstation and you don't want to be too weird, you don't have to stand up. It's okay. We'll stand up when you come to class, okay? All right, so the steps of aerobic respiration. Step 1 is glycolysis, okay? So as you can see right here, we have glucose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. C6H12O6, 6 carbons, right? So glycolysis, what happens? We want to just do a little bit of work. We got 6 carbons, right? And glycolysis basically just break the bond in between the 6 carbons. So we go from one 6 carbon molecule, which is called glucose. Make sure you do this with me and think about these words that I'm saying. Make sure you know what I'm saying. Do I know what I'm saying? I know what I'm saying. We got glucose. We break them into 3 carbon molecules, right? So this is 1, 2, 3, but this is one molecule. 1, 2, 3, one molecule. 2 3 carbon molecules. And these 3 carbon molecules are called pyruvate. Okay, so in your head, repeat after me. Pyruvate. You can mouth it out as well. Pyruvate. Okay, so we got pyruvate. So that's pyruvate. And we make 2 pyruvates. That's glycolysis. During this process, we also release a little bit of energy. And we release some electron carriers. But don't worry about that yet. Don't worry about the electron carriers. But we do release a little bit, just a little bit of energy. Okay, so that's good. We're already making ATP. We're doing things. It's fantastic. The second step is called pyruvate processing. So pyruvate processing allows us to go from pyruvate, 2 pyruvates, to 2 acetyl-CoA. So see what I did here? I got a pyruvate, right? 3 carbons. So all counting carbons. We got 3 carbons. And then during pyruvate processings, we lose a carbon, okay? So where does it going? Where's it going? It's becoming, this 1 carbon becomes one carbon dioxide gets released out of our cells and eventually breathed out. I can feel myself breathing. It's a good feeling when you're breathing, right? So pyruvate processing, we got the beginning of pyruvate processing, our reactants. We have 2 pyruvates, but then we process it because it's called pyruvate processing. We process it and we lose 1 carbon on each pyruvate. And now we form two carbon molecule, 2 carbons, each finger is a carbon, okay? 2 carbon molecules. And these 2 carbon molecules are called acetyl-CoA. Go ahead and say acetyl-CoA. Okay, how many do we make? 2. We make 2 acetyl-CoA, right? Okay, so that's pyruvate processing. And then our third step is called the Krebs cycle, we call it. It used to be called the citric acid cycle. Now everybody calls it the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle, we take our acetyl-CoA, right? We let it cycle. And then but we had 2 acetyl-CoAs to start with, right? From 1 glucose, we produce 2 acetyl-CoA cycle as well, right? So that's Krebs cycle, okay? During the Krebs cycle, this is a very exciting time because we make just a little bit more ATP. We're making even more ATP, nice and efficient. And we're releasing a little bit more of CO2 as well, okay? So breathe out the CO2. That's where it's coming from. It's currently going on in your body. I should have worn my Krebs cycle sweatshirt. You'll see it. You'll go, this nerd. Be more like a nerd. Nothing wrong about, anyway, be a nerd. It's good. Lastly, we have the electron transport chain, okay? Remember that there was that electron transport chain in photosynthesis? There's also an electron transport chain in cell respiration. So it's basically the same idea. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about the details. But the electron transport chain transports electrons, and it goes through the cell membrane. Well, not, what did I just scratch that? It goes through the inner membrane of the mitochondria, the electron transport chain. The electrons get transported inside the inner membrane of the mitochondria. During this process, as you can see, some oxygen is being used, some water is being produced, right? Oxygen, you breathe in oxygen, this is where it's being used, the electron transport chain, and then a whole lot of energy is being formed. And that's what we want. That's perfect. We want energy. We got energy, okay? So let's do this whole thing together. Say the words out loud or mouth it out. If you're in the dorm, you can say it out loud, right? But if you're at a study station, you can whisper it, okay? You ready to whisper? Okay, we got glucose, okay. We got glucose. Glucose has 6 carbons, right? Got your glucose? Let's put the 6 carbons together. We got glucose. Okay. Glycolysis, pyruvate processing, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Okay, see what we did here? I already explained it. I'm not going to explain it again, okay? Look at this picture. Once again, glycolysis, glycolysis, pyruvate processing, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Okay, so remember that these are the steps that we go through. The last thing that you can see from this image, we'll talk about it again in the future, but you can see glycolysis, and glycolysis takes place inside the cytoplasm. So it's outside the mitochondria. This is the mitochondria, right? Pyruvate processing actually transports pyruvate into the inner membrane. So many bells. Don't worry about that. But the Krebs cycle, as you can see, takes place in the matrix, right? And the electron transport chain goes through the inner membrane of the mitochondria as well as some intermembrane space and the matrix situation, but it's mostly in the inner membrane, okay? All right, take a look at this one more time, and we're moving on. Lastly, last part of today, we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration. There are 2 types of anaerobic respiration. We already learned a little bit about it back on Tuesday. Number 1 is called alcohol fermentation. Number 2 is called lactic acid fermentation. You can write down number 1, alcohol fermentation. So alcohol fermentation is exactly what it sounds like. It's this fermenting process. By fermenting is just anaerobic respiration. But alcohol fermentation produces alcohol, right? That's what it says. That's what it's making. So in this picture, you can see aerobic respiration on the top. Alcohol fermentation is something that yeast does a really good job with, and it produces alcohol, and it also produces bread. I'll talk about that in a second. So yeast can do regular aerobic respiration and produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and a lot of energy, and that's great. But yeast, when you don't give it any oxygen, it's going to do alcohol fermentation. And what it does is that it produces, without oxygen, so it's not using oxygen in the process, it produces carbon dioxide, which is what makes bread rise. I think a lot of you know this already, but if you didn't know, now you know. And it also produces alcohol that adults can use. Don't even think about it. You're not an adult. Low energy. There's not a lot of energy being produced, but really this process of aerobic or anaerobic respiration, they're all just trying to produce energy, okay? Right? We're just trying to get some energy, right? So even though this is not a whole lot of energy, it's still very helpful, right? If yeast got a lot of sugar, it can afford not producing a lot of energy one time. It can just do it, a billion more times, and it's going to be enough energy for the yeast to live. Okay, so you're welcome to write these words down. But what I really need you to do is to write down the equation on the bottom. Okay, I'll talk about that in a second. But these words, as you can see, says bread, beer, wine, liquor industry depend on yeast to ferment sugar into ethyl alcohol. But what I need you to know is that, first off, the human body can't do alcohol fermentation, right? Something you can think about is, if your body can just do alcohol fermentation, nobody needs to drink alcohol anyway. Nobody drinks alcohol ever again, right? Because you already got the alcohol. Also, you'll be drunk all the time. That would not be a great time for anybody, okay? Okay, so what I need you to know from what I just said, your body does lactic acid fermentation, which makes your muscle sore, not alcohol fermentation, okay? So now let's write down this equation. Let's break it down a little bit. So what you see over here, we have glucose to 2-pyruvic acid, or 2-pyruvates. That's what we saw on the 2 pages ago. We saw glucose to pyruvates, right? During this process is called glycolysis, which is why it says glycolysis up here. And during this process, I said there's a little bit of energy made. In fact, there are exactly 2 ATP being made during glycolysis, okay? So during alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation, they still go through glycolysis first. That's where they get that little bit of energy, okay? This is why your body does it, right? When you're exercising and you're, lifting and your muscle gets sore, the next day, what is really going on is your body is harvesting this little bit of ATP that we can get really quickly, but then lactic acid happens, okay? Anyway, alcohol fermentation. The reactant is glucose, right? But then the product, we have alcohol and CO2, as you can see. Alcohol, CO2, and a little bit of energy. All of these, both of these, produce a little bit of energy. But alcohol fermentation obviously makes alcohol, and it also makes CO2, which is what makes bread rise. In our body, we do lactic acid fermentation, still uses glucose, still doesn't use oxygen, but it produces lactic acid instead, and it doesn't produce CO2. Okay, let's go ahead and write down this equation. Pause if you need to. All right, our very last page of learning, we have lactic acid fermentation. We have this guy. He looks like he's famous, but I don't remember his name. Might have been the World Cup at some point. I'm sure it was. But maybe when I added this picture, it was a World Cup. I don't remember. It's been a long time since I added this picture. Anyway, anaerobic respiration. You're welcome to read this, but what it's basically saying, I'm going to not let you read this so you can listen to me. Okay, it's the last part of our learning. You can do this. Lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid, right? But they're not just producing lactic acid so that our muscle can get sore. Your muscles being sore is not helpful, right? What is helpful is getting that ATP from lactic acid fermentation. So imagine this. You're lifting, okay? At the beginning, you're lifting this up. At the beginning, your body's just, the muscles that are used to do the lifting are still just doing regular cell respiration because we got plenty of oxygen. We can produce a lot of ATP using our regular cell respiration. Why not? We would do it, right? But then here's the problem. you use all the oxygen, right? Your heart is beating fast, you're breathing faster, you're trying to get the oxygen through your bloodstream all the way to your muscles, but that's too slow, right? You're asking a lot of your muscles, but the oxygen can't be supplied to your muscles fast enough. So what do you have to do? You have to do something different, right? You got to find a way. If you're running away from a tiger, you can't just be like, oh, I ran out of oxygen in my muscles, I stopped running, now I get eaten. No, right? You got to keep running. So now your body is a little strained, right? Your muscles don't have oxygen anymore, but you're still asking for more ATP. Where do you get that ATP? You get it from lactic acid fermentation. So now you can read it. Maybe not. Oh, there it is. Now you can read it. It occurs during exercising when the body cannot keep up with the increased demand for oxygen, but also at the same time, lactic acid fermentation, like we talk about, happens really fast. So we can produce. It's not an efficient use of our glucose. It's not an efficient use of our food, but we can produce a lot of ATP in a really short period of time because glycolysis is just one step, right? You saw earlier, regular cell respiration takes a whole bunch of steps, and it takes a little bit of time. So if you're trying to make a lot of ATP in a really short amount of time, you can just do lactic acid fermentation a whole bunch of time. You just go glycolysis to ATP. It's not enough. Okay, here's some more. Okay. So as a recap, lactic acid fermentation is used, 1, when you don't have enough oxygen in that area of your body. 2, when you're asking for a lot of oxygen, asking for a lot of ATP energy in a really short period of time, okay? And then the second bullet point is just saying, as you know, your muscle is not sore for the next 20 years. They, get broken down, and then you're fine. All right, now, you've gotten through this entire PowerPoint. You've watched this video. You're tired of hearing me talking, so I stopped talking. Your job now is to look at these questions, each one of these questions, and think about what is the answer, okay? So I'll tell you the answers, just to make sure, but pause and write down the answers yourself, okay? Or think about your answers, at least. Where do organisms get energy? Food, obviously. Why do all organisms need food? Because they need energy. Why? Okay, I'll be normal. Why do macromolecules differ in the amount of energy they contain? Because different types of macromolecules have different numbers of bonds. So they have different amount of energy. They have different types and different amounts of bonds, chemical bonds. You'll learn all about chemical bonds next year in chemistry or during the summer. Quick plug, honors chemistry is their summer honors chemistry. You can use honors chemistry to kind of boost you a little bit in your science career at Georgetown Prep. Find out more from Ms. Bai if you're interested in hearing about it. Or you can email Ms. Emeka directly. Actually, don't talk to Ms. Emeka. She doesn't want to talk to you. Talk to me first. Number 4, no, she does want to talk to you, but it can't just be giving Ms. Emeka work when she doesn't even know that I'm talking about her right now. Number 4, what is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is the process of using oxygen and glucose to produce energy, but you also produce some carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. Write the overall equation that I just said. Number 5, what is the relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration? The product of one is a reactant of the other one, and vice versa. And they both are this process that allows energy being converted from one form to another form, or from one type of chemical to another chemical. Number 6, maintain homeostasis. So cell respiration produces a lot of ATP, right? So those ATP get used inside your cells to allow cells to do its job, right? Active transport, for example, allowing, cells to make more DNA, proteins, all of that. Maintaining homeostasis, the constant environment, right? Cells naturally actually want to fall apart. You didn't know that. Now you know. The energy that's being used in your body literally keep your cells intact. Isn't that great? Number 7, what is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? One uses oxygen, one does not. You know which one is which. One produces more, aerobic respiration produces more energy per glucose. So for one glucose, it produces more energy. It's a slower process. It has more steps. It also produces carbon dioxide always. Anaerobic respiration is faster. It doesn't use oxygen. It doesn't produce as much ATP compared to aerobic respiration in terms of ATP production per glucose. Two types of anaerobic respiration. We have alcohol fermentation and we have lactic acid fermentation. Products of each. Alcohol fermentation produces alcohol and CO2. Lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid. Yeah, the answer is itself. Where does energy use to make ATP from? Chemical bonds and glucose. We got bonds, remember? Bonds holds energy, right? That energy, when bonds are broken, it releases the energy, and that energy gets used to make some ATP in our body, which is great. Energy cannot be created and destroyed. I've said that enough times. Do you know it? You better know it, okay? All right, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for your patience. I will see you on Friday. Namaste. I don't even know what it means, but I think it's thank you. I don't know. Have a blessed Thursday, everyone.